I have great respect for your pastor. He's someone who deeply loves Jesus and deeply loves you. And I think he's a very safe leader, and it's a privilege to serve alongside him in this city. I love this neighborhood, and so it's nice to come here. I just live up the street a little bit, but it's always great to be around here. What we're gonna kind of do this morning is jump off of the passage that was read. So we're not gonna go through that. We're gonna focus just really on this one word of worry or anxiety and unpack what that word is about. So I hope it's gonna be helpful for you. By way of introduction to the topic, Galatians 5:6b. We're not doing 6a, that's about circumcision, that's for another week. 6b says, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. So if you were to summarize all that our life is about, the only thing that counts is faith expressing it through love. What a bold statement to be able to summarize all of Christianity, all of our life, with those two words of faith and love. So I get love. I get why that would be the primary motivation of our life, why it's what we're all looking for, hoping for, wanting to give to others. That makes lots of sense, but why faith? How do faith and love relate to one another? Well, for the longest time, I really just thought faith was the way that you get to heaven. It wasn't very practical for me. It was, I know I should, believe in him, but I didn't really understand its significance. And now I see that trust or faith is the foundation of a love relationship. It's impossible to give or receive love unless you have faith, unless you have trust. Can you imagine how that's true? If you don't trust somebody, you're not going to receive from them or give to them. What I think is true about our nation, and can I say Vancouver in particular, I've been here now for since my 20s. I came to study at UBC. I was a shop teacher for a few years, and then been doing this pastor thing for a while. And what I've noticed is that it seems like our culture wants the maximum amount of love with the minimum amount of faith and trust. So everybody wants to have some kind of loving relationship, but very few people want to engage in trust. And it seems like if there's anything in scarce supply, it's this whole idea of trust in our society. And so I do lots of counseling with people and discipleship. And it seems as though if we listen to somebody long enough, their issue goes back to the issue of trust. It really doesn't matter what people are struggling with. At the end of the day, can I trust Jesus? So given its importance, what undermines trust or faith? And I think it's the word fear. Now, the Bible uses anxiety, I think, to describe an unhealthy or perhaps dangerous kind of fear. But fear in itself isn't a bad thing. We should be afraid of God. We should be afraid of fire and don't run across the street, those kinds of things. But God seems to use the word anxiety or worry to characterize a particular kind of fear that can become problematic for us. Now, here's what's interesting about this idea of anxiety. It's the primary emotional concern in the Bible. It's mentioned 300 times. 12 times more often than do not make idols. And not making idols is kind of a big deal in the Bible. 4 times more often than not being proud. It's a major theme in the Bible. I have a relatively extensive theological education. It was never mentioned. It was never mentioned. I have, I don't know what it is, 14 or 15 years of post-secondary education. Nobody ever talked about it. And yet it's a major theme in the Bible. It's the primary issue that God addresses in every leader in the Bible. You do a quick Bible study and you'll see how that's true. And of course, you know that it's the mental health issue of this time, isn't it? I think we're all struggling with anxiety in certain degrees. I go through huge waves of anxiety many times in any given year and multiple times in any given day. And so I think it's a big deal in our life. It's a big deal in the Bible. So it deserves that we would ask the question then, what is anxiety? And if there was a drum roll, this would be the moment. Anxiety is what it feels like to mistrust God. Anxiety is what it feels like to mistrust God. Isaiah 12:2 and other places contrast trust and fear. It says, surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. So what we find in Scripture is the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And the primary thing that undermines faith is anxiety. Robert Mulholland says, anxiety is characterized by attempting to control one's life. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? If anxiety is kind of feeling out of control, and so what we want to do to feel back in control is we try to manage our life and make it small enough so that we feel in control. And so we work on having clear boundaries, and we learn how to say no, and we learn how to be self-aware and manage our emotions. And all of these kinds of words are trying to take the messiness and chaos of life and kind of find a quiet space to slow down and to find peace again. Here's the challenge with that. Life can't be controlled. I hate to break it to you, but it's true. Debbie and I have 10 children. You can pray for us. We have 3 biological, 2 adopted, I think 3 foster kids, and 2 other. And we had 4 kids for a long time. Then about 15 years ago, there was 6 more kids were added into our family. And so we are never bored. We have never been bored for a very, very long. We're hoping to be bored. We're looking forward to that, but it's not happened. And our life is messy. My oldest son, Jonathan, we had a family trip with all of us, and it's an event, when we go on a family trip. And he wanted to bring along one of his friends. And so one of his friends came along, and he would just need to go for walks now and then, just to get away from us, because it was so overwhelming being in our presence. And we don't really notice that. It's just our family. But people who hang around, they go, wow, there's a lot of, I'll say it politely, life. Around. But here's what's been helpful for us, is that in the midst of all that chaos, we've understood something, that you can't actually control your life. And maybe when our life isn't controlled, that's an opportunity to jump into something that's much more profound in the way of trust. But here's what Robert Bloch says. Anxiety is a thin stream of fear trickling through the mind. If encouraged, it cuts a channel into which all other thoughts are drained. So it's possible to be absolutely controlled by anxiety. We think that the way to get out of anxiety is to find some sense of control. Well, anxiety tries to control us. And it's possible that we can be thoroughly debilitated by anxiety. There's been times in my life where I wasn't able to get out of bed or think straight or be able to preach a sermon. There was a time when I was pastoring. It was for 3 or 4 months where I couldn't speak. I just stood up and said, how y'all doing? And tried to have a bit of a conversation. I was just so full of anxiety. So how does anxiety work? Here's a little helpful. If you'd like to be anxious, here's how to do it, all right? Make sure you take some notes. It's recorded in Genesis chapter 3. So again, this is remarkable because this is the story of the fall of humanity. And so anxiety finds its roots at the very beginning of time, at least our time. And there's a process that we go through in order to feel anxious. Here's how it works. In Genesis chapter 3, it says this, did God really say? So this is the serpent tempting Eve. And his opening temptation is, did God really say? What is the first thing that we need to do in order to feel anxious? It's mistrust God. What did God really say? Is he really good? Is he really powerful? I never thought of, And we start to mistrust God. Now, if we mistrust God, what does he say then in response? You'll be like God. if you can't trust God, well then who's the best person to, no one loves you better than you, which of course is a lie, but nobody loves you, so you trust in yourself. So mistrust God and then trust in yourself. Now, what is the appropriate response to trusting in ourselves? Anxiety. If it's all up to us, God help us. Like if you have to design your life, find peace, find joy, find purpose, find security, wow. Manage all of your relationships, and then love Jesus on top of that, that's a tough life. And so anxiety is the appropriate response to being in charge. It's the appropriate response. If I can't trust God and I have to be in charge, it is right that I freak out right now. That's the right thing to do if we're in charge. So, did God really say, you'll be like God? And then it says, I was afraid. And then Adam did two things. He hid, and then he blamed the woman. So we mistrust God, trust in ourselves, feel anxious, and then out of anxiety, we actually act sinfully. We either, it's fight or flight. We either withdraw and hide, or we blame and attack. Those are the two forms of what anxiety looks like. So we'll say that now. Anxiety leads us toward two extremes of control, to underfunction or overfunction. So that's what anxiety, it just always looks like that. So I try to control it, and if I can't, I pull away and at least try to control myself. But it's always about control, and it always looks like fight or flight. But what's interesting is that if we reverse engineer that and go back up the other way, we see that this way to manage life, which becomes quite sinful in that we're either passively not caring for others or we're trying to control them, is actually coming from anxiety, which is coming from feeling like we have to be in control, which is coming from mistrust. Therefore, Psalm 37, verse 8 says, do not fret or worry. It only leads to evil doing. Isn't that interesting? That the Bible connects anxiety with evil doing. So what does anxiety look like? It looks like over under functioning. Let's look a little bit more deeply. Anxiety is always serious. If you go to a family or a business or even a church community and nothing's funny, it's probably anxious. Anxiety has a hard time enjoying things. It's always very serious. We're always managing things. This is hard. We're worshiping Jesus right now. Don't smile. It's very, very serious. I remember this one time, Jonathan's my oldest son, and then our second oldest is Toby. He lives in Montreal now. He's one of these snowboarding dudes. And he's always about 3 years ahead of all fashion trends. It's very, very funny. And so he always looks awkward because he's about 3 years ahead of everybody else. But right now, and don't worry, it's coming your way. Well, some of you are doing it, but it's big, baggy pants and then high white socks. And he wears all of his toques inside out. Because how could an institution ever capture the complexity of who he is? And so anyways, so, that's him. So growing up, he had two pastimes, snowboarding and annoying his mother. And I'm not sure which he enjoyed more, but he enjoyed them with equal, vigor. And so one time, my wife is German, and he's adopted, but he still thought he was German. So one day he comes home from school and he says, hey, Mom, I'm thinking of getting a swastika tattooed on my cheek, And it's kind of like press go. And I can't believe that you'd say that. Not all Germans are Nazis, And he would say, well, it would be small, as if that's anything. And they're just, doing this. And so the joke is I've taken my course. And so I say, hey, Tobes, why don't you get a swastika tattooed on all four cheeks? And then he thinks this is funny, and it's done. He just walks away, chuckling. Anxiety can't live in the presence of humor. It just can't. But anxiety looks like being serious. It looks like being rule-based. You know, if we're feeling out of control, we think that rules are our friend. And if we can just organize our life well enough, then everything's going to be okay. And if we can organize other people well enough. My wife grew up in a Lutheran church, and I preached there once, and they didn't like me. And so what they did is they made a rule, and the rule was no non-Lutherans could preach at the church. Well, guess how many non-Lutherans were there? Just one. Like, just tell me I was horrible, or that you didn't agree, or, whatever. Nope, we have a rule now, and phew, we got rid of an awkward moment. Non-Lutherans will never preach in our church again, praise God. And it's a way to manage anxiety, it's to be rule-based. Labeling. Labeling is a very fascinating thing that I don't want to, it's my first time here, so I have to be polite, but it's fascinating to me because I'm older now, if you haven't noticed. And it's fascinating how younger people explain themselves. Now, hi, I have ADHD. I'm an Enneagram 8. And they go, it's like, oh, nice to meet you, 8. And it's just fascinating to me how we explain ourselves using labels. And we explain other people using labels, an ethnic label or a personality test, and we become reduced to caricatures of ourselves. It's an interesting thought. But we use labels to simplify ourselves and others. And the problem, there's benefit to labels. Don't hear that, especially if it's medical. But it's interesting that we try to get rid of the complexity of how God has made us and made others by reducing ourselves to caricatures. It's anxiety. It's a form of anxiety. Isn't that fascinating? And finally, anxiety is self-centered. Because everything else is chaotic, I've got to pull in. And I've got to make my life small and manageable. And anxious people take everything personally. What are you trying to say? So it's why Psalm 37 becomes so important. Do not fret. It only leads to evil doing. So here's what sin is. Sin, there's lots of definitions of sin, but this is one for today. Sin is trying to manage our emotions without faith. That's what sin is. My life is chaotic. I've got to manage the chaos. I'm not trusting in Jesus. I'm only trusting in self. And so sin is what anxiety management looks like. Let's take the most obvious thing, stealing. Why does somebody steal? Well, it's anxiety. I don't believe that God's going to look out for me, so I'm going to have to look out for myself. And this is the best thought I have for how to do that. If I'm feeling insecure and I don't have positive self-esteem, what I'll do is I'll gossip. If I don't believe in how God values me, I'm going to have to somehow value myself and puff myself up at the cost of putting other people down. Here's what's interesting about sin. If you trace sin back to its source, it's anxiety management. So, if we deal with anxiety first, we deal with the seed before it flowers into destructive sin. So being able to recognize our anxiety is super helpful. And as we manage that, it doesn't have to then blossom into kinds of behaviors and words that alienate us from God and others. Romans 14:23b says, everything not of faith is sin. Wow. That when we're not trusting God, we're going to have to manage our own lives, and eventually that leads us into the kind of behaviors that break relationship with God and others. So what's our freedom? How do we get out of this? Well, to get free from anxiety is not the removal of stress. Stress and anxiety are two very different things. Stress is called life, all right? It's just called living. There's always difficult things that are going on. Anxiety is how we manage stress, but it's not stress itself. So many people think that the way to overcome anxiety is to reduce our life, to purge it of all stressful situations. Well, again, good luck with that. For sure, don't live in Vancouver. That's a bad idea. Live very far north. That's, maybe that'll help you a little bit. But it's the idea that people think that stress and anxiety are the same thing. No, anxiety is a response to a stressful situation. So anxiety then is a state of mind, not a set of circumstances. Anxiety is a state of mind, not a set of circumstances. And that's why just organizing our life actually doesn't get rid of our anxiety, because we can never make it organized enough. The problem is seldom the problem. Our anxious reaction is the problem. This, of course, is in contrast to the Apostle Paul, who says in Philippians 4, that he's learned to be content in whatever circumstances. So how then do we find peace in the midst of chaos? We have 2 points and then we'll conclude. The first is to treat anxiety as a relational issue, not an individual issue. Now, we don't have time to fully jump into this, but to be made into God's image is to be made in the image of a relational God, a God of love, who's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in one. God is relationship within himself. And so we're relational people. What this means then is that anxiety isn't centered inside of self. It's actually how we relate. It's a relational issue, not an individualistic issue, which means that it can't be solved internally. It's solved relationally with God and with others. I have a bit of a counseling background, and it's interesting that the way that family therapy worked, let's say, I don't know, in the 50s and 60s, is that if you went to see a therapist during that time, a family went to see a therapist, the counselor would ask, what seems to be the problem? And they would point at someone. And that person was called the IP, the identified problem. Or they would be the black sheep of the family, perhaps. But they would just point at a person. And then what basically the therapeutic model is that they try to fix the person and then just reinsert them into the family and hope that everything would be fine. Well, what they discovered was that the IP was actually a symptom of an anxious family dynamic. And as soon as the person went back into the system, the family, they just acted out the way that they always did. And so this was a huge discovery that anxiety was actually a relational issue, not an individualistic issue. And so it was only until they could have healthy family dynamics that the anxiety could go down in the family and there was no longer a need for a black sheep. So anxiety is a relational issue that then is solved relationally, first with God and then with others. I think about when this became very clear to Debbie and I. My daughter Jessica, she likes to be called Jessie, but I named her, so I'm going to call her Jessica. Just getting that out there. And when she was in elementary school, just up Fraser Street there, and she had a great, time in elementary school, and she led one of her friends to Christ, and she's just this happy girl. And then she went to JO in John Oliver in grade 8, and it was super, super difficult for her. She's a pretty girl, and so, boys aren't very nice, and she would just get picked on and bullied, and it was really, really hard. But we didn't know any of that. And so Jess would come home from school, and she would just be super sullen. Me go, hey, Jess, how's your day? She go, fine. She go, anything interesting happened today? Why do you always ask me these? Why don't you just leave me alone? And she'd do this particularly with Debbie, my wife. And it was getting really, really difficult. She was angry, bitter, sullen, stayed in her room all the time. It was a really, really difficult time. So this one day she comes home. She looks as sullen as she ever did. I take her by the hand. We go into the living room. And I sit with her. I say, Jess, what's going on? This is not you. You're not like this. And she just has this, if you can imagine, a pierced look on her face. And then a tear starts to come out of her eye. I go, Jess, what's going on? And she says, Dad, they're bullying me at school. And, I can't tell you the names that they call me. When I'm in PE and I miss the volleyball, they do the slow clap. You know that slow clap? Oh, my blood was boiling she's my daughter. I love her so much. And that anybody would treat her that way was just incredibly angering. And then she says, and the girl who she had led to Christ the year before, she says, I won't say her name, but she says, and she says that she wants to go to hell. She doesn't want to be a Christian. And she bursts into tears. And so I just hold my daughter and pray for her. And then it's a little bit off topic, but I say, do you want to know how to deal with bullies? She goes, sure. Because she'd calmed down by this point. And because we're connected. It's a relational issue. I says, the way that you deal with bullies is if a bully says to you, you're an idiot, you go, I am not. I'm a stupid idiot. You have no idea what to do with that. You just go low. It works every time. Just go lower yet. They don't know how to handle that. The next day she goes to school. She's in PE. She misses the ball again. And she goes, thank you, thank you, thank you. Isn't that outstanding? Nobody teased her again. She wasn't anxious. But I said to her, Jess, you can't talk to your mom the way that you were talking to her. She goes, yeah, I know. So I said, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to figure out how to say sorry to mom, but in a way that's meaningful. And so I know she's a super creative person. So I says, go off, think about something, and then come back and tell me. She comes back 5 minutes later, and she says, Dad, I know what to do. The summer before, just like a month before, I used to go to Hawaii every year, tough gig, and teach at a church there. And this time, Debbie came along and Jessica. And when you have 10 kids, it's really special if you can just, it was just her. And we spoiled her. I mean, she swam with dolphins. She got pictures with parrots on her. And we just really, really spoiled her as best we could. And she had a great time. And so she comes back. She says, Dad, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make for Mom a Hawaiian breakfast. And so she looked up a recipe for Hawaiian pancakes. I don't even know what that is. And she played Little Mermaid music. That's the best that she could think of. And she had drinks with little umbrellas. And little Jonah, our youngest, I think he was 4 or 5 years old at the time. He was the bartender, and he had 2 coconut shells. And she got all the kids involved. And Debbie came down, closed her eyes. She came in, and the room was just so wonderfully done. She's amazing at those kinds of things. And then she had every child go around and say what they appreciated about Mom, and she was the last one. And she says, Mom, I love you so much. I'm so sorry for the way that I treated you. Now, if I would have said to her, stop treating your mother that way. I want you to go and apologize to her right now. What would you get? Sorry. That's about all you would get. But when we deal with our hearts and our hearts become reconciled, then we're able to choose more loving behavior that's genuine. I won't do this to you here, but what I often do when I teach this is I have somebody and I just ask them to put up their hand against mine, and I push. And they always push back. And I go, what are you doing? And they go, I'm pushing. I go, did I ask you to push? They go, no. I go, but everybody does. And the harder I push, the more they resist. And anxiety is control. It's trying to control the world around us, and we actually create resistance. And being non-anxious allows us to be peaceful and present in a moment so we don't have to push. So I don't have to tell my daughter, stop disrespecting your mother and start doing what you're told. And how dare you do? That's just pushing. And then we get an equal and opposite reaction in that just raises the anxiety. So if anxiety is a relational issue, how do we manage our anxiety? We seek a better person to react off, and that's God. As we respond to God instead of reacting off of others, we become peaceful and present. We're always going to live in a reaction. Did you know that? We're always, because we're relational beings. All we can choose is who we're going to react off of. It's a dumb example, but when I grew up, I played lots of badminton. I was a skinny little kid, and rugby and stuff like that was out of the question, so I took up badminton. And I loved it. I played like 6 nights a week. I was really, really into badminton. And I'm not bragging or anything, but my coach told me that I have a really great swing. I know. Now, if a 5-year-old came up to me and said, you suck at badminton, what would that do to my heart? Nothing. Why? Because of what my coach told me. And instead of reacting off of a 5-year-old, as I respond to what my coach says, I have a way of staying peaceful and present, even in the midst of being mocked for something. Anxiety decreases when we're in the presence of an all-loving, all-powerful God. And as we live in response to him, instead of reaction to our circumstances, our hearts change. Let me tell you one more story and then we'll conclude. I really like mountain biking. I was up there yesterday, and I try to go quite often. I really enjoy it. And so I'm up mountain biking one day. I'm on my own, and Mount From. And a young guy, I'm old, so a young guy pulls up beside me, and he's really chatty. And so I ask him, what he does, and he's in the film industry, and he moved here to go mountain biking. I says, oh, well, you must be a nice guy. And he thought that was funny. And he goes, what do you do? And I go, I'm a pastor. And then it got really quiet. And I says, well, tell me, what is your experience of Christianity? And so we're biking up the hill, and for a good 20 minutes, he goes off on the church. And he says the church is the biggest problem in the world. It's the reason why there's AIDS in Africa and why there's wars around the world. He just goes on and on about how horrible the church is. So what he's doing is he's pressing, right? He's pushing. So he finishes, and he goes, sorry, man, I just kind of went off there. I go, no problem. I go, and here's what I say to him. I say, you don't know the half of it. We're way more messed up than you could ever imagine. I live in this stupid thing, and this is my whole life, and trust me, you don't know the half of it. And then I go off on the church for about 5 minutes. I go, the people who have hurt me most in life is people in the church. And so I'm not pushing. Now, if somebody is pushing towards me and I'm not pushing back, where are they now? They're closer. And so here's what he says after that. He says, to be honest with you, Christians are also the best people that I've ever met. Now, if I was anxious, he would have never said that. I would have to defend the church. See, we're really good people deep down and stuff. Like we really are. And anxiety wouldn't allow relationship to occur. So here's our conclusion. Our issue is trust, not worry. Could you please hear that? If you struggle with anxiety like I do, I don't have an anxiety problem. I have a trust problem. And anxiety is my friend for this reason. I often can't tell when I'm mistrusting God. I often can't tell. I'm just living my life. But anxiety is the physiological sign that I'm not trusting Jesus in a moment. And when I'm not trusting him, then everything goes sideways. But anxiety helps me remember Who am I trusting right now? Myself, my circumstances, or Jesus Christ? Mark 4:40 says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" So rather than manage our feelings, which are symptoms, it is better to trace our feelings to their source and ask, what is motivating me right now, fear or faith? And this, to me, is a question that I ask myself many, many times in any given day. And what I do, I don't do it, obviously, but what I do is I take my pulse and I say, what's motivating me right now, fear or faith? And if fear is motivating me, no matter what I do, it's always going to go weird. But if faith is motivating me, then the opportunity that God's love would be made manifest greatly increases. So what's the result of faith? It is love. It's a love relationship with God and others. And so can I please encourage you to not be afraid of your anxiety. If you get anxious, don't be afraid of it. Everybody's anxious, I think. Some people pretend they're not, which is more concerning to me. But everybody's anxious. The invitation that God gives is to trust him. And as we take our pulse, we're able to be peaceful and present instead of fighting or flighting. And so God gives us an invitation today to find our hope and trust in him. Can I please pray for us? Father, I thank you so much for the gift of anxiety that reveals where our hearts are at in regard to you. And so, Father, I ask that you would give us the grace not simply to manage our emotions or to control our circumstances, but to trust in you, to be defined by our relationship with you. And thank you that as we remember who you say we are, as we find our security in you, that we're able to engage in a chaotic world in the peace of the Lord. So we thank you for the gift of who you are. And we choose to worship you, to know you, be defined by you, be filled by you, for you to be our reference point, to trust in you, because you are practically our salvation.